Hello. Story 1. This unsettling experience occurred almost 8 years ago, and its memory has remained vivid in my mind ever since. At the time, I was in my early 20s and had embarked on a camping trip deep within the wilderness of Upper Idaho. While I wouldn't have described myself as a highly experienced camper yet, I did frequently undertake extended hikes and possessed a fundamental understanding of camping practices. The region itself was known for its abundant wildlife, notably including both black bears and grizzly bears. Consequently, thorough preparation was absolutely essential, a requirement that often deterred many casual hikers and campers. The population density in that area was quite low, and one would typically encounter only an occasional tourist navigating the trails. Most of the designated campsites in Upper Idaho were far from crowded. Despite the general lack of crowds, and acknowledging that it was perhaps an unnecessary precaution, I consciously sought to avoid the more frequented tourist spots and instead preferred to explore lesser-known trails. For this particular excursion, I had selected a trail situated just outside the well-known major mountain range. This path meandered solely through the dense forest and along the rolling hills that bordered the mountains, only shadows melting into darkness, eventually opening up to a picturesque clearing, offering expansive views of the entire mountain range. The closest established trail I was aware of was about 3 miles away, leading to a small lake. I had specifically bypassed that option, anticipating that it might attract a few other individuals, and I sought solitude. My prediction proved accurate. Throughout my entire hike to the chosen campsite, I encountered no one else. The trail appeared virtually untouched, and upon my arrival at the designated campground, it was completely open and deserted. I proceeded to set up my tent on the farthest side of the clearing and gathered some sizable stones to construct a fire pit. With an estimated 2 or 3 hours of daylight remaining, my plan for the rest of the day was minimal, simply to relax around the campsite and contemplate my itinerary for the following day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I began to build up the campfire and roasted some marshmallows while enjoying the spectacle of the night sky. The entire valley was enveloped in a profound quietude, broken only by a gentle breeze rustling through the trees and the occasional calls of nocturnal wildlife. However, this tranquil silence was abruptly shattered by a distinct, repeated crunching of leaves emanating from the depths of the woods. After a brief moment, it became unequivocally clear that the sound was produced by a person walking. I found myself frozen, unsure how to react, simply sitting and gazing intently in that direction. I felt a sense of shock and confusion as to why anyone would be out there at such an hour, until a figure emerged at the very edge of my campsite. It was a man but the flickering shadows cast by the campfire made it difficult to discern any identifying features. I could, however, make out that he was carrying a standard camping backpack. He paused, stood there, and looked directly at me. Then his gaze swept across the rest of my campsite. Before I could utter a single word, he softly uttered, "Sorry," then turned abruptly and retreated in the exact direction from which I had heard him approach. The manner in which he apologized was peculiar. It was barely louder than a whisper, as if he were deliberately attempting to be quiet. This encounter struck me as profoundly strange. What exactly was he apologizing for? It seemed logical that he must have been searching for a campsite. There was no conceivable reason for someone to be wandering around at night in that manner without purpose. While I didn't feel a direct sense of danger, his behavior was markedly out of the ordinary for any hiker I had ever encountered. His retreating footsteps gradually faded, and the subtle, quiet night that had been momentarily disrupted returned, almost as if nothing had transpired. Despite this unusual interruption, I soon resumed my stargazing and continued to relax within a few minutes. I silently hoped that wherever that individual was headed, he would arrive there swiftly and safely. Beyond that passing thought, I didn't dwell on the incident much further. Several hours seemed to pass, or at least that was how long it felt. Eventually, clouds began to roll in, obscuring both the moon and the stars, and casting a deep shadow over the entire forest. I wasn't particularly tired or ready to sleep yet, so I continued to sit by the campfire, anticipating that I would eventually grow bored and sleepy enough to call it a night. But then I heard footsteps once more. This time, they were more hurried, almost like panicked strides, tearing through the woods from the exact same location the man had appeared from earlier that evening. I rose to my feet, a growing sense of worry gripping me as the sounds drew closer. Then he emerged into the light. I could readily identify him as the same hiker from before, judging by his backpack and general physique. He advanced further into my campsite this time, allowing me a clearer view. He sported a medium, scruffy beard and oily black hair, and his clothes showed signs of distress, with dirt smeared across his face. His eyes were wide with what appeared to be fear, yet his mouth remained rigidly straight and devoid of emotion. "Is everything okay?" I asked, adding, "You probably should have made it to your campsite by now. It's pretty late." The man stood there, visibly catching his breath, but maintaining a vigilant stance. His eyes briefly darted over my right shoulder for a second before snapping back to me. "Are you lost? Maybe I can help," I offered. He then mumbled a quiet no under his breath, stating that he was merely hiking in the woods and hadn't intended to disturb me. However, his speech was slow, and throughout our conversation, his eyes constantly flickered to something positioned to my right. He would only glance for a split second before his gaze would intensely lock back onto me. Uh, Listen, you look pretty nervous. I can help. Maybe send a radio message for you or whatever you need. I pressed. He seemed to disregard my words, but then his eyes fixed on me with even greater intensity than before. "You're camping here right now. Why?" he demanded, his tone deeply unsettling. His eyes darted to my right again, and I found myself unable to resist the urge to glance over my own shoulder. There was nothing there, only empty, dark woods. I was becoming profoundly unnerved now and debated how much longer I wanted to engage with this individual, let alone attempt to assist him with whatever predicament he was facing. Then, he posed an even more chilling question. "Is it just you here? Are you alone? Where are the others?" Taken aback by the abruptness of the inquiry, I hesitated to respond immediately. Before I could even formulate an answer, he spoke again. "Have you been following me?" Something was distinctly amiss. His demeanor was shifting, and he was noticeably tensing up. I promptly replied no, and stated that I had no idea what he was talking about. But then, his eyes shifted onto something over my shoulder once more. This time, however, they did not return to me. His wide, hollow eyes were fixated on an unseen point beyond me. He uttered one final question. "Then why are you with her?" I instantly spun around and peered over my right shoulder, but my gaze met nothing. Still just empty, dark woods. I turned back to face the man, his face contorted into an expression of sheer terror, his eyes still staring intently beyond me, before he abruptly broke into a sprint, vanishing deeper into the woods. Within mere seconds, he was beyond the reach of the campfire's light and completely gone. The direction he fled was nowhere near the established trail, nor did it lead to anything discernible. My heart, however, was still pounding. I frantically scanned my surroundings, particularly behind me, desperate to comprehend what on earth that man had been referring to and what he had been seeing. In those brief moments after he asked, "Then why are you with her?" I had believed I had connected all the pieces. I thought this man was being pursued by some woman or a group of individuals in the woods. And when I glanced over my shoulder, I fully expected to see her standing there, deranged and terrifying. But now I no longer knew what to believe. What I did know was that I was scared and absolutely would not remain there any longer. I quickly packed up all my belongings and began to move. Even though I had witnessed the man running in the opposite direction from the trail, I remained on high alert throughout the entire walk back. Every subtle sound made me jump, anticipating that I would see some woman following me, or whoever the hell he was talking about. But I never did. I successfully reached my car and promptly drove away. The following morning, I decided to file a report with the local police station concerning the man out there, because with more time to reflect, I had grown quite worried about his well-being. While I cannot provide a definitive explanation for the events of that night, I can offer a plausible theory for the situation, having discussed it with dozens of people over the years. The most probable and tragic explanation is that the man may have become profoundly lost and had been wandering out there for an extended period. This prolonged exposure likely led him to become severely hungry and dehydrated, pushing him to the brink of near insanity and intense paranoia. In this state, he would have believed that something or someone was relentlessly pursuing him through the dark woods. Regrettably, due to his impaired mental state, he was unable to recognize help when it presented itself. When he stumbled upon me, he was likely too consumed by paranoia to comprehend that I could have saved him, offering food and water and guiding him out of the wilderness. He might have been so disoriented that he no longer even realized he was lost, entirely consumed by the paranoia of whoever he imagined was following him. While this remains the most likely cause for the man's behavior and the events of that night, there is still no definitive proof that it is actually true. There exists a possibility that he genuinely was being followed and was simply unsure whether or not I was another stalker, part of the group, and therefore didn't trust me. If that were indeed the case, then his terrifying outburst that night likely saved my life from whoever else was lurking out there. However, we will probably never know the definitive truth. The man has never been found or seen since, so it appears, unfortunately, that he never made it out of the woods. Story 2. On a particular night, I was at home, fully intending to pull an all-nighter to catch up on some work papers that had reached their deadline. I had procrastinated on these documents for a bit too long, and with a couple of other impending commitments, I truly had no alternative but to stay awake and complete them that very night. I prepared a cup of coffee, ascended the stairs to my home office, and secluded myself inside, determined to eliminate any distractions and power through the hours ahead. To my surprise, I managed to work quite effectively for the initial few hours, steadily sipping my coffee and maintaining focus. However, as my coffee supply dwindled, so too did my energy, and I could feel my concentration beginning to wane. I considered that perhaps a brief stretch and a trip downstairs to brew another cup might help me reset and regain my vigor. I rose from my chair and descended to the kitchen. But as the coffee brewed, I noticed a distinct chill in the air downstairs, a sensation of cold that was markedly different from the rest of the house, as if a frigid breeze was circulating through the lower floor. I proceeded to check the thermostat and confirmed that the heating system was active, yet the temperature displayed was several degrees lower than it ought to have been. Pursuing this anomaly, I conducted a brief investigation and happened to discover that a window at the back of the living room was wide open. While I did frequently open my downstairs windows during the daytime, to the best of my knowledge, I had never previously forgotten to close them. Furthermore, This particular window was entirely ajar, not merely cracked open, as I usually did. Understandably, I felt a degree of apprehension as I approached it, pausing to observe it for a moment. The disquieting thought that someone might have opened it and gained entry into my home began to creep into my mind. Nevertheless, I found no other evidence to support such a notion. I cautiously extended my head outside and inspected the ground directly beneath the window, but there were no footprints or disturbances in the dirt. Similarly, the window itself bore no marks or signs that would suggest someone had crawled through it. In moments such as these, one's mind often strives to convince itself that it is overthinking, that something so alarming would never truly happen to them. I began to rationalize that I had simply opened the window a bit wider than usual earlier that day, and had subsequently forgotten to close it. With no other indicators to suggest otherwise, I closed the window, retrieved my freshly brewed coffee, and ascended back to my office upstairs. Over the course of the subsequent 30 minutes, I found my thoughts continuing to drift, not entirely satisfied with the conclusion I had reached. Consequently, I decided to get up and swiftly conduct another thorough sweep of the house, simply to be absolutely certain that I was alone. I discovered nothing amiss and returned to my work. Another hour elapsed. I was feeling mentally drained from my efforts to complete the task, but a sudden, loud thump from behind me instantly jolted me awake. The sound was exceptionally loud, as if it had originated directly behind my desk, yet there was nothing physically present back there. I knew that my bedroom was situated directly on the other side of that wall, and presumed the noise must have come from within that room. However, the sound was far too resonant to be simply dismissed. And given the earlier incident with the open window, it was challenging to prevent myself from fearing the worst this time. Still, I got up, walked into the hallway, and slowly opened the bedroom door. I cautiously scanned the room from the hallway before stepping inside. From the threshold, everything appeared perfectly normal. One would expect such a pronounced sound to have an easily identifiable source, perhaps something heavy having fallen to the floor, but that was not the case. The floor was clear of any objects, and as I meticulously searched the remainder of the bedroom, there wasn't a single thing out of place. I was honestly beginning to suspect that pulling this all-nighter was causing me to lose my mind. I returned to the office, but for the next 15 minutes, it became incredibly difficult to concentrate. I was certain I had heard a thump directly behind me. It had been so loud. Eventually, my focus completely broke, and I spun around in my chair, looking directly at the wall, from where the sound had originated just a quarter of an hour earlier. As I stared at the wall, pondering the enigma, I suddenly felt foolish. There was a closet right there. It was merely a small, narrow closet that I utilized exclusively for storing old clothes and winter jackets. I had, in fact, completely forgotten about its existence. feeling a surge of curiosity. Though not truly expecting to discover anything, I rose and walked over to it, carelessly sliding open the door. My breath instantly caught in my lungs, and a crippling wave of fear washed over my entire body. I found myself face to face with a complete stranger. He was merely inches away from me, positioned at the very back of the closet, concealed behind all the hanging jackets. If not for the thin barrier of clothes separating us, he likely could have reached out and grabbed me before I even had the slightest chance to react or run. I heard the entire closet structure begin to tear apart as the unknown man violently forced his way out, intent on pursuing me. As I scrambled frantically into the hallway, the man uttered my name, instantly sending an involuntary shiver through my very core. His voice was unfamiliar to me, yet it was gritty and deeply disturbing in the way he pronounced my name, as if he knew me intimately. I managed to make it safely out of the house, as it appeared the man was expending more effort in attempting to verbally persuade me to cease running rather than actively chasing me. I reached a neighbor's house just around the corner, relentlessly pounding on their door until they finally answered and contacted the police on my behalf. When the police arrived and searched my home, the man was no longer inside. There were, in fact, hardly any discernible signs indicating the direction he had fled. And that, regrettably, is largely where the investigation has remained. Some deeply unsettling, unknown man had seemingly entered my home through one of my downstairs windows in the dead of night, carefully navigating through the house, and ultimately concealed himself in my office closet. This likely occurred while I had left my office to perform my initial check of the house after noticing the open window. This means that for probably over an hour, the man was directly behind me, silently watching me as I sat at my desk working. Even more chillingly, he knew my name, which definitively suggests that this was a premeditated break-in orchestrated by a potential stalker. The knowledge of the possibility that he might return is profoundly unsettling. Had I not chosen to pull an all-nighter that evening, and had instead simply gone to sleep, I very well might not be here today. This terrifying incident transpired only a month ago. Story 3. This incident occurred just a month ago. It was a Saturday, and while I typically opted to stay home and engage in no particular activities, this particular Saturday was an exception. One of my closest friends was celebrating her birthday, so I felt somewhat obligated to attend. It wasn't intended to be a large, boisterous party. Rather, it was planned as a gathering of our intimate group of friends, perhaps enjoying a few drinks and conversing for a couple of hours. I resided in an apartment, conveniently located just a 10-minute drive from my friend's house. Around 6:30 p.m., I drove over to her place. The gathering itself was rather ordinary. Not truly a party in the traditional sense, more of a social get-together, I suppose. However, we did end up consuming a fair amount of alcohol while chatting. Eventually, at approximately 1 a.m., most of the attendees had either departed or made the decision to spend the night. I personally disliked sleeping anywhere other than my own bed at home, but I was also still a little tipsy and was unwilling to risk driving under the influence. Perhaps going against my better judgment, I decided that I would simply walk back to my apartment. My friends assured me it was perfectly fine to leave my car parked in their driveway, and I had made the walk countless times before. It was a mere 25 to 30 minutes, primarily through the quiet residential suburbs. I bade farewell to the remaining friends who were still present, then set off on my journey home on foot. The weather was calm, and the initial part of the walk proceeded without incident. The entire neighborhood was enveloped in silence and stillness. There were no moving cars or people outside, nor were there any lights illuminating the homes. Everyone, presumably, was already asleep. At one point during my walk, however, a sudden pair of headlights appeared, approaching down the road. They weren't excessively bright, and the vehicle was moving slowly until it drew very close to my location and then came to a complete stop. The driver cracked open their window, but due to the darkness and the window not being fully lowered, I couldn't clearly see who was inside at all. A man's voice called out, inquiring if I was all right or if I required a ride anywhere. I replied that I was fine and expressed my thanks, and without any further exchange, the car drove off. I gave the encounter no further thought at the time. From his voice, he genuinely sounded as though he was simply concerned for my well-being. I continued walking along the same road. Another couple of minutes elapsed, and the neighborhood remained as quiet as it had been before. But then, a street sign ahead of me reflected a light originating from behind me. I turned around and saw the same car, now approaching down the road from the opposite direction of its previous appearance. This time, however, it pulled off to the side of the road and parked, rather than simply passing me by. I still found it rather peculiar that he had turned around and returned this way, only to stop and park as soon as he came into my line of sight. It struck me as an exceedingly large coincidence. I continued walking, glancing behind me a few times, but the individual never exited his car, and eventually he disappeared from my view. I reached the next section of the neighborhood, hoping that this recent occurrence was nothing to be concerned about. Yet, of course, walking alone in the middle of the night caused every detail to feel exceptionally suspicious. I began to feel a little more at ease with every passing minute. However, I was only about 10 minutes away from my apartment at this juncture when I suddenly noticed another car parked up ahead. It was positioned directly in the middle of the street, with its headlights on, not on the side of the street or pulled up to the curb. As I drew closer, I was able to discern more details and definitively confirm that it was the same vehicle from before. A knot formed in my throat, realizing that the probability of this being a mere coincidence was rapidly diminishing. From my current location, there were essentially only 2 routes to reach my apartment. Typically, I would simply follow this main road because it would take me most of the way there. However, I also knew there was a park ahead that contained a walking path cutting directly through the dense woods. I rarely utilized this path because most of the times I made this walk were at night, and the trail through the woods lacked any lighting whatsoever, making it generally safer to remain on the illuminated street. I considered that this might be a situation where traversing through the woods would actually be less hazardous than walking directly past the car, which was clearly observing me with an uncomfortable level of attention. However, as I drew nearer to the known entrance of the trail, I realized the car was parked unusually close to it, positioned only a short distance ahead. It almost seemed too perfectly placed. As I approached closer and closer, the more I looked out into the woods, the more uneasy I became. I had to trust my intuition. I continued walking past the entrance to the woods and proceeded toward the parked car. I held my breath as I passed it, but nothing happened. Once I reached the front of the car, I glanced back, and peering through the windshield, I saw that no one was inside. This car, which had seemingly been following me and was now bizarrely parked in the middle of the road with its headlights blazing, was completely empty. After a few seconds of internal deliberation, I looked further back toward the woods, and barely visible through the profound darkness, I could make out the silhouette of a man standing slightly out from behind the trees, clearly watching me. I took no more chances. I immediately broke into a run. It was only a matter of a few seconds later that I heard the man get into his car. I instinctively pulled out my phone as I ran, and thankfully, that must have deterred him, because instead of giving chase, he executed a U-turn and drove away. I did not cease running until I had reached the safety of my home. Afterward, I reported the incident to the police, describing what unequivocally seemed like an attempted kidnapping. Everything had been far too coincidental to be anything else. What remains terrifying to contemplate is that if I had not listened to my gut feeling and had instead made the seemingly obvious choice of cutting through the woods, I would have walked perfectly into that man's trap. He would have been waiting in there, anticipating that I would do precisely that. Being out there in the dark woods with him would have undoubtedly left me with no conceivable chance of escape. It has only been a month since the incident, and with only a description of his car and his voice, it is unlikely that the authorities will ever find or convict anyone. Bye.